This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting from the labyrinth holds of Daedelos Krata. In this broadcast we track the bronze shadow of Asterion Moloc, Satrap of the Daedelos Krata, bringer of wrath, spear of judgment, the execution of the High Lords unleashed when victory is not enough. This is a chronicle of sieges ground to powder, of boarding actions fought knee-deep in embers, of gene vaults and hex crowns, of a warlord who turns problems into endings. Strike the seal of subscription, or be listed among those who have hesitated when the ledger closed. Steel your will, guard your faith, and fix your gaze upon the bronze helm that never bows. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the lore of Asterion Moloc. The Imperium keeps two kinds of names in its ledgers, those that comfort the faithful, and those that make even loyal men glance toward the exit lights of a briefing hall. Asterion Moloc belongs to the latter column. He is the chapter master of the Minotaurs, a lord of war whose arrival at a war zone turns plans into executions and battles into erasures. Titles cling to him like ash: Satrap of the Daedelos Krata, bringer of wrath, brazen warlord, spear of judgment. None of them are poetry. Each is a record of function. He is sent when the result required is not victory but elimination, and the line between the two is measured in how many survivors are left to tell the tale. Those who have seen him at close quarters describe a presence more felt than observed, a pressure in the air like the moment before storm fronts break. He advances in labyrinth-etched Terminator plate whose bronze sheen makes torchlight crawl like living fire across its plains. His helm lenses glare the deep red of banking furnace coals. Where other commanders wear banners and relic fetishes, Moloc wears scars and ormetics, repairs stacked upon repairs until the boundary between what was born and what was built becomes unimportant. He does not move like a noble, he moves like a verdict. His armament has become part of the story. In his right hand he bears the Black Spear, a relic whose silhouette recalls the guardian spears of the Emperor's custodian, half forged to counterbalance with predatory grace, blade edged to part ceramite the way a tide parts reeds. Its power field sizzles not with ostentation, but with appetite, and its inbuilt energy discharges open battle tanks like tin and carve firing steps out of the fortress walls. On his left forearm rides a storm shield so old that helic glyphs incised across its face defeat the lexicons of most Imperial savants. The shield's edge is dented with the memory of impacts that would have folded dreadnoughts. Seen together, spear and shield tell the only prayer Moloc accepts: advance, break, do not stop. To call him merely a killer is to misunderstand the scale of harm he delivers. He is an organiser of ruin, a logistician of annihilation. He knows where the propellant comes from, which conveyors feed the manufacturer that stamp the shell casings, how long a traitor faction's tether will hold once those conveyors burn. His campaigns read like ledgers in which every deficit belongs to the enemy. Water vaporised, silo farms slagged to glass, orbital anchorages cut loose to tumble and crater their own cities. When he orders batteries to fire, he already knows which bridges will fall and how quickly withdrawal routes will turn to kill zones. Anything that remains afterward is a rounding error. His command practice matches that temperament. The Daedelos Krata, his massive assault carrier, is not a flagship so much as a moving citadel and abattoir. Within its sensorium-lit darkness, Moloc sits a brazen throne among stacked data looms and Voss Orcspex pillars, listening to the heartbeat of wars as they stutter into palpitations and then silence. Chaplains bear his decrees through the ship like wardens carrying keys. Captains receive them as sentences, not suggestions. There are no speeches. There are determinations issued in a voice that does not rise because it never needs to. The catalogue of those he has personally ended is recited in whispers by remembrancers who value their continued breathing. Renegade chapter masters taken in boarding tube duels and nailed to their own command pulpits. Orc warlords smashed down amid mountains of groaning plates and snapping power claws. Xenos princes toppled on terraces of black glass while their bodyguard phalanxes folded under overlapping bolter fire. Champions of the dark gods whose warp-thick blessings could not turn aside a spear point placed with the cold geometry of a master. Each kill is the blade-thin visible edge of deeper work, the isolation of a fleet, the starving of a planet, the careful turning of allies into spectators until the moment arrives when everyone understands the outcome, and only the dying remains to be performed. Imperial commanders who have worked with him, some only once, speak of a paradox that never resolves. On the one hand, Moloc obeys. He does not grandstand at councils, does not argue priorities, does not barter for glory. He receives a directive and interprets it with the most severe literalism possible. On the other hand, he makes choices within that obedience that many would not. He will collapse hab blocks that shelter partisans and citizens alike if it shortens the fighting by a week. He will demolish a shrine world's outer rings to deny a heretic army their iconography of courage. He will claim vessels and war trophies at campaign's end because doing so will make the next purge faster. The High Lords have uses for such a man, other Space Marines have long memories. In the line of battle, he is not a remote figure hunched over Holodiths while others bleed for his equations. When the line must break, Moloc is there with his Terminators, shield locked, spear punching like a piston through ranks, the bronze wall moving forward with a speed that the eye denies until it's inside the enemy's formation and everything becomes severed and falling. He does not bellow challenges, he does not declare lineages, he identifies the linchpin, standard bearer, vox hub, icon, warlord, and takes it. The morale effect accomplishes the rest at ammunition's leisure. There are accounts, rebroadcasts of suit telemetry, fragmentary pick feeds, the half-coherent testimonies of survivors dragged out from under Promethean charred rubble, that insist Moloc should be dead. They count wounds, calculate spool loads, plot the angles of torso strikes and conclude that nothing biological persists beyond the third impact. Yet he returns, again and again, marching through smoke with fried paint bleaching his armour to a dull pale, or emerging from a teleport flare with black frost clinging to every plate seam. Apothecaries of the Minotaurs are not talkative men. They do not answer questions about what percentage of their master is living. The question stops mattering when the spear point finds your thorax. Even his allies feel the wake he leaves. Guardsmen steady because somebody must, but they fall back into silence afterward as if the conversation might call something down on them. Navy crews track his transponder with the fascination of those watching a storm cell crawl across a radar sweep, knowing that wherever it lands, clearance reports will have to use new categories. Other chapters keep their distance. Some refuse joint operations altogether. All of them read the same bulletin headings, inked by the administratum clerks who never sleep. Threats ended, rebellions concluded, crusades balanced by final sums that line up neatly if you don't look out the viewport while you add. If there is nobility in him, it is iron grey and without ornament. He has no speeches to comfort the citizen, no last-minute reprieves to offer the condemned. He carries out the Emperor's will in the sense that a headsman carries out a sentence, not vindictively and not mercifully, correctly. In an age that worships survival, Asterion Moloc is the liturgy of consequences delivered by a man who does not blink. His legend does not burn, it grinds. It does not promise hope, it guarantees an end. To understand Asterion Moloc's present is to run into a wall of missing pages. The archivist will show you references to the Minotaurs at widely separated points in Imperial history, a campaign notation from the 32nd millennium that describes a chapter by that name as Berserker Keen, eager to answer musters but difficult to direct once engaged, a cluster of contradictory entries that place them within or after the 21st founding, the cursed cohort whose experimented gene seed lines birth more problems than legions. Then nothing, dark shelves, sealed folios, inquisitorial sigils. The sequence resumes much later with a chapter at full strength and a chapter master whose file begins not with origin but with outcomes. The Vanishing, which the Administratum shrugs into the ledger as status unknown, lies in the late M38. The reappearance belongs to the upheavals of M41. In between are rumours that look like fingerprints left in wet lacquer, an unnamed patronage at the highest levels, supply chains that do not cross the usual depots, reliquaries filled with war trophies no outside eye ever audits. There is always a logic to secrecy in the Imperium. Sometimes the logic is defence, sometimes it is shame, sometimes it is both. What can be said with confidence is this: when the Minotaurs resurfaced, they were not limping. Their fleet tonnage would shame some segmentum reserves. Their warplate was not a patchwork of battlewood scavenge, but an arsenal in depth. Their cadres trained to a single cultural note that outsiders learn to recognise in a single hour's observation. Task completion over everything, including reputation, including cooperation, including the glow of being thought as heroic by one's cousins. The chapter that vanished was notorious for being uncontrollable in its rage. The chapter that returned was disciplined in the service of finality. The difference looks less like growth than refounding. To ask where Moloc came from is to invite contradictions sharper than those that cling to his chapter. No one can produce a name for his aspirant years, his rise through scout and battle companies, his first captaincy. The Gene Magi cannot point to a stable heritage mark without hedging. The physical evidence, his immense stature, the stamina that survives injuries rated terminal, encourages speculation while proving nothing. Whispered arguments break out behind sealed doors about whether the Minotaurs use mechanisms unavailable to most chapters. Engrammic transmission, for example, by which a personality's imprints could be impressed upon a successor, advanced reconstruction protocols that cross the invisible border between repair and reproduction, custody over relics that do more than symbolise. The theories are as dangerous to utter as they are difficult to disprove. The Minotaurs do not sue for libel, they simply stop replying. It is tempting to link the mystery to the chapter's relationship with Terra's own. The Minotaurs answer summons that no one else hears. They receive deployments that land with the weight of edict rather than request. They appear where wayward Astartes are to be disciplined, where loyalist politics have curdled into standoffs that normal chains of command cannot resolve. Their victories often come wrapped in consequences that somebody else must describe to petitioners later, when the smoke has thinned and the sobbing has stopped. Outsiders, building patterns out of too little data, decide that the High Lords keep a dog for the work that other dogs will not do. If that is true, it is also true that the dog wears its own mind. The iconography of the Minotaurs is deliberately ancient. Bulls' heads and labyrinth sigils march across banners and shields. Company seals look like they were cracked off the lintels of old earth palaces. The chapter badge reads like a threat from the Bronze Age carved into plasteel. Asterion Moloc sits at the centre of that design language as if he was the original author, not its inheritor. The Daedelos Krata amplifies the impression, a ship that is not simply big but resolute, a maze that confuses borders and bears down on orbital lanes with the bad temper of a siege tower. Officers in other fleets call it a relic, and then correct themselves. Relics are visited, this ship visits. There are other fragments that still make it into the open. Records that accuse the earlier Minotaurs of answering the call for aid and then prosecuting their own wars to the point of overkill. Scouts who note that the chapter seems to retain a longer than average memory for slights and a broader than average definition of provocation. The gaps between those fragments are exactly where legends grow, a collective of stories about what the Minotaurs did in the quiet centuries and who taught them to come back quieter, harder, and organised around a single terrible idea, that a chapter can be a tool meant for tasks that do not forgive witnesses. And Moloc. He appears at the head of this revised instrument with the certainty of a man who has no interest in apologising for its edge. If there is a birth world, he does not share it. If there is a Primarch whose statue he crosses himself before, he does not name it. What he does do is place his spear upon the table like a signature and let the chapter around him be proof that the past, whatever it was, achieved its purpose and is therefore irrelevant. Space Marines often speak in litanies that explain them to themselves. Asterion Moloc has only the one that says we are here, and you will be ended, and there will be no footnote. When inquisitive minds press further, the responses fall into two categories: silence and action. The first is the more merciful, the second expresses itself in the rapid tenure of questions, which cease to be asked because the askers are assigned elsewhere, or no longer have careers in which to be curious, or die of unrelated causes in turbulent regions. In the Imperium, such matters indicate nothing by themselves, but enough nothings in a row look like emphasis. Whatever he was, wherever they were, the Minotaurs of the 41st millennium have decided the answer is contained in their conduct. Asterion Moloc leads that answer down boarding tubes and across ash plains, and the galaxy understands him because endings are a universal language. The first time the wider Imperium is forced to acknowledge that the Minotaurs are back, not as a rumour, not as marginality scrawled in the margins of crusade rolls, but as a force with mass, is in the convulsions that follow the death of Lord Solar Macarius. Victories beget appetites. Borders he drew in blood begin to look like invitations to ambitious men. The Macarian heresy is less one rebellion than a tangle of them, a set of grievances and opportunisms flowering across multiple subsectors at once. The call goes out, and into that call power answers. Among the answers of fleet architecture the Navy officers blink at once and count again. Minotaur hulls, not one or two, but a constellation. Strike cruisers in numbers that demand careful planning, a battle barge with a predator's silhouette, and at its heart the Daedelos Krata, looming like a moving continent. There is no grand announcement, the Minotaurs translate in and begin to work. Where other chapters convene parliaments of war to apportion honour, Moloc's chapter claim assignments as if they were invoices already stamped. Pick feeds from the first systems to fill their tread show the pattern that will repeat. Shock assaults that do not pause once a breach is cut. Close quarters fights prosecuted with an emphasis on smashing resistance rather than collecting prisoners. Munitions expenditure that makes guard logisticians pencil sums twice and discover, with a faint twist of the mouth, that the sums hold. The Minotaurs hit critical nodes and hold them, with the contemptuous strength of those who do not expect relief and do not need it. Imperial auditors note something else: the abundance. A chapter absent from polite company for centuries should look threadbare. These warriors look supplied. Their plate is not a museum of repair, it is an armoury. Their transports cycle in the numbers required to keep multiple ground operations fed. When a siege is needed, they do not borrow artillery, they bring it. Supplies flow to them via routes that do not match the diagrams in the quartermaster's office. The conclusion writes itself in the silence after the meeting breaks up. Someone powerful wants them this way. Moloc's strategic signature becomes legible to his allies, reluctant or otherwise, over the course of months. He does not seek the enemy's decisive field battle as an affair of banners and boasts. He will take if it ends the work quickly, but he prefers the steady taking apart of the conditions under which an enemy can continue to be an enemy. The result is a series of fast, ugly victories that move maps and make civilian prefects weep into the hands when they understand the reconstruction bills. The alternative would have cost more, and longer, and in blood the Imperium cannot presently spare. That is the defence his methods never have to voice, because outcomes speak better than lawyers. It is in this period that the Minotaur's relationship with other Astartes curdles into something permanent. The incident that historians abbreviate to Exocene begins with proximity and ends with scandal. The astral interceptors, notionally on the same side, find themselves on the wrong end of the Minotaur's patience. Accounts vary about provocations and precedents. The result does not. The interceptors are smashed nearly to non-existence, their relics confiscated, their flagship claimed as a prize by a chapter technically lacking authorities to take such a prize from kin. The shock rolls outward, amplified by the interceptors' allies. The Ultramarines, who keep excellent lists, add this one to a column that will never be erased. By the time the 14th Siege of Antagonos grinds through its calendars, the tone has set. The Minotaurs prosecute the operation with the same blunt certainty that they bring to all sieges. Supply cut, approaches mined, strong points reduced, counter-attacks bled until they collapse into spasms. At a council there, words are exchanged. Marnius Calgar's name is attached. In the retellings, to dignity affronted and patience worn. The detail matters less than the conclusion. The Minotaurs will not be made housebroken. They fit, or rather fitted, into the Imperium at a different angle, not as brother knights among equals, but as a lever the High Lords are content to pull even if it makes others squeal. When the Macaran heresies are extinguished, some by capitulation, others by exhaustion, still others by the careful application of orbital fire that renders arguments mute, the Minotaurs withdraw with a brisk tidiness of men closing a ledger. They have collected ships and relics in the way a glacier collects rocks, as the natural consequence of movement. They have made friends of a sort, the wary friendships that form in shared danger, and they have made enemies who will not forget. None of this appears to trouble Asterion Moloc, who has demonstrated that the chapter he leads can arrive, operate at scale, and depart without needing to explain itself to anyone not positioned to be obeyed. In the internal chronicles of the Adeptus Astartes, those not meant for lay eyes, the Minotaurs begin to take on a functional title: Executioners. When a brotherhood strays, when a crusade leader's ambition outstrips prudence, when loyalist logistics snarl into pride and feuding, when the Inquisition needs a mailed fist rather than a writ, when an enemy's fortress monastery must be taken apart by men who will not go gently when they encounter their own kind across the breach, then the Minotaurs appear in the planning margins, and Moloc's name next to them like a stamp. The Badab War lies ahead to prove that point in letters large enough for even the reluctant to read. But already, in the way the Imperium speaks around them, the Minotaurs have ceased to be a chapter among chapters, and have become something sharper. For the common soldiery grinding through the aftermath, the memory is simpler. They remember bronze giants who did not stop to boast, and did not stop for much else either. They remember the peculiar relief that attends a horror that is at least predictable. They remember the way rebel banners fell and did not rise again once the spearhead went in. For the nobility who counts cost, there is resentment. For the High Lords who count survivals, there is satisfaction. For Asterion Moloc, there is only the next directive, the next logistical diagram pinned beneath his gauntlet, the next set of coordinates where something that calls itself resistance will become past tense. The order that drew Asterion Moloc toward Badab did not arrive as supplication, but as summons, the sort that carries more weight than parchment and sigils. The Maelstrom zone had ignited. Huron's astral claws and their allies had turned secession into a fortress, anchoring their rebellion across the shoals and warp tides of the treacherous region. Loyalist forces gathered in waves. The first shattered on reefs of prepared defences and treachery. The second wave came with iron in its voice, and among it translated the Minotaurs, full chapter strength, the Daedelos Krata at the heart like a mobile citadel. Moloc made his will plain before the first shell arced. He did not attend the allied war councils, no stirring speeches, no debates in gilded halls. Where other chapter masters traced arcs on hololiths and haggled over honour, Moloc sent a single shadow to stand in his place, Reclusiarch Ivanus Encomi, gaunt as a razor blade, to relay calculations and verdicts. Encomi's words were cold iron. The Minotaurs would take the assignments that cut deep and bled longest. They would prosecute those tasks, unaccompanied if necessary. They would accept neither delay nor interference. Badab demanded cruelty even from the righteous, and Moloc arrived ready. He mapped the successionist logistics. Void lines were strangled, munition way stations were seized and turned into spikes aimed back at their former masters. Orbital anchorages, so carefully cultivated by the Astral Claws, were hit not to capture but to collapse, raining their carcasses onto shipyards and manufactura below. When a bastion fell, Minotaur demolition teams salted the ground with charges that turned victory into emptiness, denying the enemy the easy habit of reoccupation. On the ground, the Minotaurs moved with the blunt rhythm of a pile driver. They preferred assaults that traded finesse for finality. Breaching charges punched mouth-like rents through ferrocrete. Terminators advanced as a bronze phalanx, storm shields locking into a moving wall while the black spear rose and fell at Moloc's leading edge. Counter-attacks broke on that wall with a sound like surf tearing itself apart. Halls flooded with Promethean fire, choke points choked with bodies, vox nets dissolving into screams and static. These became the Minotaurs' calling cards across the Maelstrom's fractured zones. The secessionists learned quickly that Moloc did not bargain. Garrisons that attempted to parley were pinned by artillery fire until their flags burned and their signals failed. Then the Bronze Giants came in at a trot that seemed too swift for their mass. Prisoners were a rarity of arithmetic rather than mercy, too costly to guard while the next breach waited. The Minotaurs counted efficiently, and in Badab's grim math, survivors inflated the bill. Moloc's operational signature contrasted with other loyalist instruments. Where the Carcharodons descended as a storm of knives to reap and disappear into the dark, Moloc's Minotaurs arrived like siege towers and stayed, shouldering aside counter bombardments, turning captured bastions outward, and converting kills into positions and positions into irreversibility. Their presence reshaped the battle space. Loyalist admirals began planning around that fact the way architects plan around bedrock. The Maelstrom's treachery lay not only in warp tides but in its people. Worlds that wore imperial quillers on their coins had grown accustomed to the patronage and protection of the astral claws. Those symbols blurred when siege taxes were counted and rebel convoys kept bellies full. Moloc had no patience for ambiguity. Manufactura that had forged shells for secessionist guns were put to the torch. Planetary governors who had asked for time to consider their allegiances discovered their administrative spires decapitated by land strikes. In the afterglow, the Minotaurs established blockhouses manned by squads who understood that order meant the absence of opposition, not the presence of applause. There were set-piece battles too, and in those Moloc proved a pragmatist without sentiment. On moonbound fortresses where the astral claws had layered fire arcs like a master calligrapher's strokes, he forewent the proud frontal storm and instead cut. Boarding torpedoes speared into the void platforms at shift change. Teleport beacons flared into existence in the worst possible places. He had no qualms about detonating a gantry under his own assault wave if the collapse would carry traitor elites down with it. The second wave stepped over the spray of armour shards as if they were rain. If the Loyalist coalition noticed that Moloc never asked for permission to act, they noticed too that he never needed it. Targets assigned to the Minotaurs ceased to be variables. Vox reports from those sectors shortened to laconic updates. Contact made, breach achieved, resistance reduced, position held, next objective underway. The few times Allied staff tried to retask Minotaur companies mid-operation, the replies came stamped with Encomi's seal. Brief, clinical refusals citing priority of results. Officers could dislike Moloc, but they could not argue with the rectangles of conquered ground stacked up like ledgers. Badab's story is a warehouse of atrocities and heroics. Moloc collected neither. He collected completions. When he encountered the secessionists' most gilded warriors, the tyrants' veterans in their baroque blue and silver, he treated them as another obstacle on the path to the munitions lift they guarded. When he cracked a shrine fortress that had watched over its world for 1,000 years, he did not pause to scrawl a history. He marked its coordinates as neutralised, set satchel charges in its ribcage and pulled his companies out through the ash. By the midpoint of the war, secessionist captains had evolved a superstition. If your Auspex paint a labyrinth sigil on incoming drop caskets, write your will. They whispered another, harsher truth to one another when the spirits of their weapons felt heavy. Don't get pinned by the Minotaurs. They won't stop. There won't be anyone left to rescue. Moloc listened to none of it. He watched the Maelstrom's map thin under his gauntlet and made the next cut. The coalition needed an executioner. In the opening acts of the Badab War, Asterion Moloc proved he had come to be exactly that. Every long war writes its own chapter of pure horror, a distillation of all the conflict's logic into a single day. For Badab, that day was named Optera, and its author was Asterion Moloc. The Lamenters had marched with the secessionists for reasons that read on sympathetic parchment, like tragedy. Misjudgment braided with a doomed sense of loyalty to comrades who had chosen poorly. Whatever their intent, their guns had spoken against the throne. In 908.M41, the Minotaurs caught their fleet among the reefs and shoals of Optera's orbital lanes, and closed. The battle does not sprawl across weeks. It does not indulge in operatic manoeuvres. It lasts 17 hours. Moloc opened like a craftsman splitting seasoned timber along the grain. Minotaur strike cruisers hammered the Lamenters' outer screen into ragged blossoms of fire, while the Daedelos Krata put its prow through the mouth of the fight like a wedge. Boarding torpedoes went ahead of sense. Teleport flares ripened inside arteries of enemies' hulls, munition magazines, plasma conduits, Vox centrals, while lance batteries stitched behind them, forcing the Lamenters to choose between fighting the invaders inside their ribs or bleeding to death under external fire. The Lamenters chose to fight, they always did. Their yellow and black warriors met bronze in corridors furred with frost and choking vapour. In such ranges, heraldries and accusations shouted into a visor. The Lamenters fought with a grace the Minotaurs did not bother to imitate, cutting, yielding, counter-cutting, their desperation tendered as payment against fate. Moloc was not there to be impressed, he was there to finish a problem. He led one of the main penetrations himself, Not because of pride, but because the ship's heart laid down that path and he refused to entrust the final cut to any hand but his own. The bronze wall advanced at a measured lope, storm shields up, spear darting in short, neat murders, cataphracti plates scraping arco flint sparks off bulkhead ribs. Melter charges flashed, cutting locks like muscle from bone. Behind, tech marines marked junctions for demolition, laconic runes chalked between scorches to coordinate withdrawal lines that no one intended to use until the ship stopped. Deck by deck, the Lamenters yielded inches and charged yards. Chapter Master Malachim Forrest committed reserves with the gambler's clarity of a man who wants the dice to know he sees them. He led counteractions that would have turned other boarding pushes into funerals, smashing strikes into the Minotaurs' flanks, precision volleys that sought the tiny weaknesses in the storm wall's rhythm. In different circumstances, on ground chosen for honour rather than outcome, the story might have admired him first. Optera had no space for admiration. Rooms became meat lockers. Pressure doors blew and took squads with them, their bodies hammering down companionways in sudden fog banks of frozen blood. Once, an entire Minotaur file vanished when a grav plate field inverted for a heartbeat. When it snapped back, the corridor's geometry included matter that had not been designed to occupy it. Moloc did not slow. He refused grief the time it asks for. He paid that time back in meters gained. At the 17-hour mark, the Lamenters' Vox fractured into tired fragments and finally crackled. Their fleet screens were ruined. Their decks were becoming numbers with minus signs. The Minotaurs had taken losses heavy enough to make Apothecary's hands slick, but their momentum had not stopped, and momentum, Moloc knew, kills as efficiently as any blade. The order came not from a raised voice but from math. The Lamenters signalled capitulation. There is no gallantry to record here, no exchange of florid promises under fluttering banners. The surrender played out in cold ritual. Weapons dropped, helms unsealed, gene codes logged, asset lists confiscated. Moloc's officers catalogued hauls and flagged those worth keeping. The Lamenters' surviving ships, too few, too precious, were led away in tow like cattle, some to be returned after sentence, others absorbed into the Minotaur's fleet as if the war had been cold accountancy all along. The cost to Moloc was not light. Boarding battles at that intensity consumed warriors faster than campaigns. Veteran cadres came back thinned and quiet, armour webbed with micro-fractures, the storm wall missing shields that could not be mended from any locker. For the remainder of the Badab War, the Minotaurs shifted tasks. They interdicted and blockaded, strangling secessionist stragglers while other loyalists took the primary breaches. It was not a retreat, it was a reallocation from a man who had just exchanged most of a fist for the rebellion's knuckles. In later judgments handed down by the High Lords, the Lamenters would be condemned to a penitent crusade, a sentence as much about optics as expiation. Optera was their reckoning before parchment ever dried. Veterans who walked off those decks wore a look like men who had seen their reflection in a blade and not recognised the face. The Minotaurs kept no souvenirs except those that made them stronger for the next war. Hulls folded into their order of battle, munitions scored into future arithmetic. Enemies taught the lesson that capitulation to Asterion Moloc was not a negotiation, but an end state. Badab has many tragedies. For those who care about such things, the Lamenter's sorrow is among the purest. For Asterion Moloc, it was 17 hours of necessary work performed to completion. The spear lifted, the shield lowered, the ledger line drawn. What remained afterward were lists: dead, captured, acquired, redeployed. A war had moved forward because he had made it do so. That is all Moloc ever expects from a day. The Imperium bleeds along every border, and in 989.M41, the wound called Rynn's World was open to the bone. War's Snaggrod had smashed through defences and turned the Crimson Fist's home into a cauterised scar. Retaking a world from the Orcs is not a banner moment, it is months of clearing warrens and grinding nests flat until spores have nowhere left to dream of teeth. Elements of the Minotaurs entered that theatre with the same patience they brought to sieges. Void traffic choked, orbital kill zones laid, drops staggered with the exact cruelty needed to separate war bosses from their mobs. Where Orc counter-migrations erupted, they were met not with duels for bragging rights, but with overlapping fields of fire that turned green tides into thawing sleet. The Minotaurs did not linger for applause. While Rimworld skies were still crisscrossed with contrails, another ledger called. A chapter that had been declared excommunicate traitoris, the Night Reapers, needed to be reduced from problem to president. Moloc aligned with the Red Templars, and at critical junctures with the Grey Knights, whose arrival has a way of making rooms colder. The campaign that followed reads like a cautionary whisper to any chapter tempted to stray. Hidden forges uncovered and demolished, recruiting grounds sanitised down to bedrock. The Night Reapers dwindled from defiance to static, right up to the moment when even static ceased to be a sound worth noting. Not every target wore power armour. On Crixos, a world whose confessional records stank of heresy, the Minotaurs conducted what later scribes would call the Blood Purge. That phrase files the edges off. In practice, it meant street grids mapped to artillery schedules, processionals of citizens tested and sorted in the shadow of tank hulls, administratum stacks burned not for their contents but for the fungal spores that had colonised their buildings. It meant veteran squads coming back with numbers that didn't match what they'd taken out, and chaplains whose exhortations ran hoarse while their work went on. Purges are not dramatic, they're administrative. Moloc understands this administration better than most knights ever will. Through all of it, Asterion Moloc did what he always does, turn directives into done. He rotated companies so that the squads most cracked by Badab's boarding hells could drink air without the taste of coolant in it, and then he returned them back to the line as soon as steel returned to their step. He instructed tech marines to fold captured hulls into the fleet's arteries, repainting and recoding them until they pulsed to the Minotaur's heartbeat. He reorganised sieged assets into portable doctrines that could be unpacked on any world. How to starve a hive without letting its corpse disease you. How to break a fortress monastery built by hands that think like yours. How to erase a rebel governor's prestige faster than you erase his palace. Moloc's ledger is not a list of trophies, it is a diagram of throughput. Supplies arrive, orders flow, resistance is converted into absence. When the work is well done, the only noise left is the ticking of cooling metal and the unmusical work of scraping symbols from walls. His chaplains keep the flame hot without letting it flicker into zeal that might blister discipline. His apothecaries write lines of loss into the chapter's flesh and do not complain. His captains learn to read his silence as approval and his presence as a promise that the door they are about to kick through will not close until purpose has passed through it. Critics persist, of course. They point to Rynn's world and sniff that a more surgical approach might have spared more infrastructure. They mention the Night Reapers and murmur about President, as if using Astartes against Astartes does not permanently lower a bridge you might one day need to cross. They talk about Crixos in worried tones and ask whether the line between purge and butchery is too easy to misplace under battlefield smoke. Such talk fishes for a man who cares. Moloc does not fish, he counts. By the time these aftershocks of Badab had quieted, the Minotaurs had settled into the role the galaxy kept trying to describe around them. Not heroes, not villains, but executioners whose writ is written in other people's seals and whose blade lands where it is pointed. Asterion Moloc neither sought the name nor refused it, he simply kept doing the sorts of things that makes names irrelevant. When the next summons came, when an ancient metal woke in the Orpheus sector and empire from before humanity learned fire began to retake its worlds, Moloc was already turning pages, already aligning ships, already setting the ledger for the kind of war where even victories look like losses written in a steadier hand. The summons that turned the Minotaurs from executioners of wayward brothers to bulwark against an older Terra bore a simple seal. Orpheus sector, priority extreme, Xenos incursion of anomalous character. The Administratum called it an awakening. Warriors who went there learned other words: harvest, excision, silence. In 992.M41, the Maynarkh dynasty stirred from sepulchral vaults and began to reclaim the Orpheus stars with the dispassion of geology resuming after an interruption. Whole continents flickered under sheets of jade lightning. Cities died so cleanly that the wind kept its old roots through streets now lined with dust that remembered being bone. Asterion Moloc committed the entire chapter. It was not a gesture, it was the minimum he calculated would hold back an empire that had slept longer than mankind had spoken. The Daedelos Krata translated in at the head of the fleet that made navy captains draw breath. Battle barge, strike cruisers, a flotilla of escorts moved by a logistics scheme that did not wait for anyone's permission. Moloc accepted overall coordination of Astartes' assets in a theatre because no one else wanted the responsibility of signing orders that would spend chapters like ammunition. He signed them as if they were bills long overdue. The first weeks taught every lesson at once. Necron armies did not bleed or rout. They broke, fell, and stood up again. War engines unfolded from tomb priest gestures like geometry becoming three-dimensional, monoliths grinding forward on tractionless silence, annihilation barges scything lanes of gorse fire through armoured columns, ranks of warriors stepping with metronomic certainty into killing grounds as if their programming enjoyed contempt. The Minotaurs adapted the way they always do, by refusing to pretend the enemy should behave more conveniently. Kill priorities changed, triarch command nodes first, then the conduits binding phalanxes to their will, then the vehicles whose destruction yielded local disarray long enough to extract civilians or emplace new batteries. Moloc fought it like a siege that moved, chaining one brutal stand to the next with supply lines that tunnelled through void lanes already being mapped for denial, should denial become necessary. On border worlds, the Minotaurs hit landing zones with overlapping fields of fire and kept them, not out of romance for ground, but because ground was where shuttles rose, and shuttles were the difference between 1 million saved and 1 million catalogued. In Hive Warrens, the chapter's breacher cadres cut galleries through hab walls to create new arteries for refugees to flow, then wired those arterials with charges so that the moment the last column cleared, the roots folded behind them like self-amputating limbs. Apothecaries triage without tears. Chaplain's litanies hardened into short blasts of iron that told the truth. This is how you live, do not look back, your memories will wait for you if you live long enough to own them. Enemy doctrine revealed itself in patterns of cruelty older than any scripture. The Maynarkh bore the flare taint like a hereditary sin that had transformed into appetite. After battles, Minotaur recovery teams found torsos hung in lattices that had no engineering purpose except to teach horror. Where the Xenos needed information, they razored skin and made the living read it to them. Where they took cities intact, they emptied them methodically, leaving behind furniture upright and fires banked as if the victims had only stepped out. It was a war famous men would have fled from if it allowed them to admit what it asked of them. Moloc took it personally only in the sense that all problems are personal to him. He went where the pressure was highest, pressing the storm wall of his Terminators into places Imperial maps had begun to shade black. In one campaign, a world's planetary defence grid stuttered under gore storms while its governor refused evacuation, demanding an honour guard for records that would burn anyway. Moloc set his spear on the chart like a nail. The Minotaurs' drop pods cored into the capital's central bastion. Within 5 hours, the archive vaults were evacuated not with reverence but with forklifts and explosive bolts. 2 hours after that, lance batteries turned the bastion into vitriol and steam. The governor survived long enough to sign an acknowledgement that the Imperium still existed. The signature mattered for morale on 50 other worlds. Moloc had made the trade at the speed of arithmetic. Still, the strategic gradient ran only one way. The Maynarkh advanced without hurry and without fatigue. Tesseract prisms were sighted on horizons like black stars fallen to earth, their edges wrung to the human eye. Canoptic swarms droned through vent shafts ahead of phalanxes and left corridors combed of mines as neatly as hair. Every victory cost too much, and every extraction wrote a debt line against a shrinking ledger of places to stand. Messages went up the chain that used the phrase everyone in Segmentum Command had sworn not to write: sector denial. The order came back gilded in legalisms that wrap a throat before the rope tightens. Evacuate what could be moved, sterilise what could not, do not let the enemy feed, do not let them inherit infrastructure. The Minotaurs executed, because they are the instrument built for executions. They seeded worlds with virus bombs statistically sufficient to eradicate complex life and watch skies turn to curtains of wildfire as atmosphere itself became a weapon against what it sheltered. They mined orbital lanes so heavily that the first ships through a reoccupied system would find themselves flensed to slag before they could finish their thought. They pulled back in steps measured not by fear but by the time it takes to turn a citadel into a crater and then leave. Across those years, 992 to 995.M41, Moloc's reputation changed shape again. He was no longer the headsman turned on bad brothers. He had become the officer you sent when you wanted to deny the ancient their dinner. His Vox traffic stayed as short as always. Position, ammunition, extraction thresholds, counts in 6 digits read without flinching. When he slept, it was inside armour. When he dreamed, no one knew. The Maynarkh did not dream. That was perhaps their only weakness. They kept finding Minotaurs where their logic expected a retreat. They kept losing time. Time in a war is a currency. Moloc spent it like the last responsible man left in a collapsing bank. The war wrote itself toward a conclusion that the Imperium would call a strategic delay and the citizens would call a catastrophe. Yet even catastrophes have climaxes. For the Orphean War, it was a ship whose name would enter the Minotaur legend not as boast, but as a scar. A tomb vessel large enough to have weather systems in its cargo vaults, void black, moving like the idea of a guillotine. Moloc marked it for personal attention. The plan he drafted was the sort that gives even Astartes a moment pause, and then authorises itself because there is no alternative left. What followed aboard that ship would decide whether the Orphean story ended as an obituary, or as a wound that would finally stop bleeding. It began with coordinates, a tomb ship's intercept calculated from the wake signatures of dead convoys, a drift path too precise to be random. The Minotaurs watched the obscure stars and decided to cut. Assault teams rehearsed in the Daedelos Krata's kill halls, running drills until their muscles learned corridors they had never walked. Teleport beacons were built into charges that made their own doors. Squad leaders traced glyphs of the labyrinth on their shields and did not talk about luck. The opening cuts came from people who never lived long enough to tell the tale. Terminator Squad Asterion took the first translation, into heat haze and adaptive geometry with air that smelled like old coins. Their allspec showed distances rewriting themselves. Scarabs came like a spilling of black sand with eyes. Ixthalian sergeants set the beacon at the cost of fingers and time, both irreplaceable. When they were gone, there was nothing left to retrieve but ash and a point in space that now had a destination engraved into it. A glare of light bit a hole through reality and spat Asterion Moloc into it, the storm wall behind him, the chapter's best at his shoulder. The tomb ship's interior fought their eyes, a black vault edged with lights that made the air feel granular, conduits that pulsed like arteries drawn by a mathematician who hated the human curve. Lichguard unfolded in ranks with movements that harmonised and never collided. The Minotaurs hit them the way they hit everything, as a statement that what they touched would not remain what it was. Moloc knew that killing Necrons was like throwing shackles into the ocean. You only count what sinks. He aimed the spear for the brainstems of command, cryptex, overlords, the nose that instructed the symphony. The black spear earned its name here, painting thick strokes of unlight where its power field tore through living metal. The storm shield rang with blows that would have turned a land raider's glasses into a saucer. Around him, the wall moved like a machine. Shields stepped, blades bit, melter charges built a topography of molten scars that would at least make it harder for the enemy to respawn. Then the enemy lord arrived, carried forward on a dais of fields that tasted like batteries behind the teeth. Titles do not matter much to men like Moloc except as targets. The Magi would later attach the name Kutlak to this one and call him the war leader of the Maynarkh province. He wore the idea of authority like a cloak, and the walls seemed to respect him by choosing then to resume a shape that made tactical sense. Chambers uncoiling into galleries, galleries into a central space whose proportions implied judgment. If the Xenos wanted a theatre, Moloc gave them a play with one actor worth watching. The duel did not ask permission of the larger melee. It erupted inside it and rewrote the room around it. Kutlak's blade traced sigils of hunger that were older than soil. Each stroke drew out of the air a ribbon of darkness that tried to eat whatever touched it. Moloc met it with the physics of denial. Shield plane a moving wall, spear point a metronome that turned flourish into failure. He advanced a boot at a time, testing the weight behind each bind, learning the cadence of a mind that had not been slowed by breath or worry for millions of years. He found a pattern that coughed up a window as if by mistake, set his hips, and punched. The spear went home under the Xenos Lord's ribs and out through the backplate that had expected to exist longer. Energy discharged along the haft, and everything smelled like a thunderstorm inside a crypt. The dais failed. Kutlak folded into himself with the insulted slowness of a monarch cancelled by mathematics. The room answered. Fields flared in anger. Canoptic constructs poured from ducts in shapes that made sergeants curse out loud. Somewhere deeper in the ship, a proximity logic concluded that the heart was compromised and began to make a new one by shunting power and rearranging space. Moloc took one step back, and another, setting his shield as a wall for others to regroup behind. The order to withdraw was not shouted. It existed already in the fact of charges wired into pillars and the runes painted onto helmets that meant we have achieved enough. The first detonations tore the gallery's spine. The vault became a pressure wave packed with debris. Floors lost the argument with gravity and were replaced by vectors. For an instant, the world had only one direction and everything went that way. Those who saw it afterward and survived to speak said they saw their master fall. His telemetry spiked and vanished. The storm shield spun like a coin too heavy to ever settle. The spear became a streak of light that rushed out into the vacuum that had not existed a heartbeat earlier. The tomb ship swallowed the damage, as Necrons do, and began to repair itself around the hole. The Minotaurs came apart into squads with tasks: hold, cut, retrieve, leave. They did 3 of those. The 4th they refused to mark as failure. Recovery in space is a prayer conducted with thrusters and numbers. Servitors and drones combed the expanding cloud of shards and frost. Tech marines cursed coolant lines and bled on stuck valves to loosen them. The ship's cogitators kept spitting ghost signals, biometrics that flashed and died, IFF whispers cooked by radiation into nonsense. Then a ping held, then another aligned behind it like a stranger wearing a friend's face. A hull cutter burned a path through plating that had been pieces of 10 different things 5 minutes prior. The team who went through first did not waste time on adjectives. They hooked a shape out of a nest of shrapnel and rode a line back up into the airlock that would later test positive for every substance a battlefield can make. Moloc returned to his throne changed only in the ways eyes can see. The apothecaries wrote new ledgers in their neat hand. Augmetics added to the tally. Graphs extended and interlinked until the organism and the machine were married in ways theologians disliked but wars respect. They parked his shield within reach and slotted the black spear into the rack whose clamps knew it better than any other. He did not ask who had died to keep him in the column marked available. He signed orders. The tomb ship he had wounded limped away into a calculus already altered by the time it would need for repairs. In that delta of stolen hours, planets lived that would have died. The story went out anyway, because soldiers are human and need myths almost as much as they need munitions. It is said that Moloc had died and been found in the wreckage of a dead god's artery, that he had died before, more than once, and kept arriving to collect what was owed. The chapter's records did not confirm it. They did not deny it. They kept fighting. The Orphean War would end, not in triumph, but in a balance sheet the Imperium could live with. That is what Moloc had brought aboard the Black Vault. Not glory, but a number that stayed shy of 0. When wars slow, stories take their place at the front and begin probing for weak points. Asterion Moloc attracts them the way iron attracts a magnet. The facts are enough to seed a harvest, a chapter that vanishes and returns at full strength, a master who survives events written down as mortal, a fleet whose supply does not behave like other fleet supplies, a weapon that looks like it remembers a palace with walls the colour of sunshine. From those seeds, the Imperium grows myths as a coping mechanism and a method of inquiry disguised as gossip. The first myth says that Asterion Moloc is not a man but a title. It proposes a line of succession unbroken merely by heraldry but by engrammatic transfer, that each new bearer receives not just armour and a spear, but memory maps laid over his own, a mesh of reflex and recollection that makes him act like the man the chapter needs. The evidence advanced is circumstantial and chilling, mannerisms too consistent over centuries, strategic preferences that do not drift with age, a voice on the voxnet that ticks with the same metronome through 3 generations of scribes' handwriting. The refutation is simple and dangerous. To maintain such a mechanism will require technologies and permissions reserved for the custodians in the darkest vaults of Mars. The Minotaurs offer neither refutation nor confession. They do not invite auditors into the places where proof might be stored. They do not sue. They continue to be themselves with a punctuality that becomes its own argument. The second myth attends is panoply. The Black Spear is not catalogued in any Terra sanctioned inventory open to historians. Its profile and behaviour shout custodian craft, yet no decree records its loan or loss. Savants argue in private whether the weapon proves patronage by powers who do not write letters, or whether it is a relic of some earlier epoch looted in a war no one living remembers. On campaign, it does not ask such questions. It does what it was made to do: draw a line through matter and say the before side and the after side can no longer communicate. The Storm Shield pair with it bears Helic glyphs whose lexemes elude translation. The few competent linguists brave enough to admit an opinion suggest they are fragments of pre-imperial Terran script layered like sediment, each layer testifying to a hand that wanted to remember the shape of a word even after the word itself has died. Whether Moloc knows the meaning is irrelevant. Meaning sticks to him whether he invites it or not. The third myth is uglier and therefore more persistent. It insists that beneath the bronze of the titles there is less a man than his silhouette promises. It counts augmetics, armatures behind a shoulder plate that move like a machine's hinge, a torso that does not bend the way bone does, and extrapolates to horrors it cannot quite name. The conclusion for those who fear such things is that Moloc is a construct with a conscience welded on for ease of handling. The conclusion for those who admire results is that the ratio of metal to meat has never once mattered to a breached gate. The Minotaurs' apothecaries keep their own ledgers, and do not consult quires before changing fittings. If a warlord is a tool, then the hand that holds him expects him to be maintained. Set against these stories is the texture of presence. Officers who have stood near Moloc when he thinks say the air cools by a degree and the room acquires edges it did not possess before. He is not charismatic in any mortal sense, he does not gather affection. He exerts gravity. Captains find their arguments clarify under the pull, shorn of ornament. Logistics chiefs leave his chamber with lists that make more sense than they did outside. Chaplains report that sermons grow shorter after he has listened to them once. None of this sounds like myth because none of it requires imagination, it requires attention. The way he sits on campaign tells its own story. The Daedelos Krata stratagem is a carved thing of cable looms and brasswork, angles like a temple to a god of straight lines. Moloc doesn't fidget. He watches the war bloom and retract across hololithic plains and taps a knuckle against a table edge when a timer rolls over. Servitors spin up and down as his needs flow, but he never looks at them. He looks at outcomes. When a plan must be altered, he removes a piece rather than adding one, creating space for momentum to recommence. To a chapter that once was famous for rage, he's bequeathed a new tradition: violence as austerity. Those who want a gentler tale try to find it in the way he treats the dead. The Minotaurs do not sing long for their fallen, but they keep their names in an order that would satisfy a mathematician. Moloc reads those names when he should sleep. Men said this about him on Badab and again in Orpheus, and it maps cleanly onto the sort of man who signs forms in triplicate to own the cost. If he weeps, no one has seen it, and perhaps that is the point. An executioner who weeps would be a contradiction that comforts more than it helps. Across the Imperium, the Order of Sinus and others who concern themselves with dangerous assets maintain files on the Minotaurs. Some of those files bear seals that would terrify lesser petitioners into silence. Some of them contain recommendations that read like prayers disguised as bureaucratic prose. But the appendices always admit the same thing. Whatever the truth of Asterion Moloc's nature, title, man, construct, palimpsest, it yields at last to the truth of his function. He appears where someone with very old authority has decided that ending is required. He does not ask the question that keeps the pious awake, whether an ending can be good, he asks whether it will be complete. So the myths persist because the Imperium is a machine that runs on them. They make fear navigable and obedience plausible, yet they are optional. The Black Spear is not, the Storm Shield is not, the Bronze Man who advances with them and leaves behind systems reorganised around his decision is not. When his boots ring on a deck, when the labyrinth sigil flashes on a bulkhead as a squad rounds a corner, when Voxnecks shorten their grammar because he is listening, what remains is not legend but event. In a galaxy that too often confuses stories with salvation, Asterion Moloc is a reminder that some things are exactly what they are: a warlord, a weapon, a will that refuses to negotiate with the conditions that breed defeat. If the day comes when the truth of him is finally spoken in a hall large enough to hold it, it will not change the way he carries the spear. It will not alter the vectors of a charge or the angle at which his shield takes a blow meant to end a brother. The myths will fall away like burnt paint, and underneath will remain a finish the fire could not eat. Some will call that finish faith, others will call it programming. Moloc will call it duty, and he will already be walking toward the next door he has promised to open. Asterion Moloc returned to the war that does not end. The Indomitus era does not forgive pauses, it uses them to breed Hydra heads. As the Minotaurs slipped into lanes where Navis charts had been rewritten in Terra, Vox feeds brought the same litany in a new dialect, worlds shorn to bedrock by Xenos harvests, shrine systems shouting prayers with their throats cut out, war bands of traitorous Astartes cruising like carrion fish along pilgrim lines. There is no shortage of employment for a chapter whose brief reads "Finish this." The Minotaurs' rebuilding had begun before they cleared Terra's orbital palaces. G&C came back to its vaults with seals unbroken and warnings engraved: contaminate nothing, trust nothing, test twice. Primaris cadres, already blooded on the crossing, rotated into companies where their reach and lungs changed the rhythm of assaults. Veterans learned new geometries, breach templates revised for taller frames, shield walls recalculated for different strides. There is nothing romantic about adaptation when survival is the prize. Moloc wrote drill schedules like a budget and enforced them like an embargo. Where they went, the records write in the same short grammar that attaches to the Minotaurs wherever they make themselves present. Void Dock complexes held by heretic hosts were treated as cripple points, seized, repaired just enough to serve Imperial throughput, then thickened into outworks that made enemy counterattacks spend themselves in cones of fire measured to the meter. Black ships needing escorts through regions where the warp snarled like wire found Minotaur halls slotting into formations without ceremony and leaving them with equal economy once the duty was done. Frontier bastions that had once been shrines before they were fortresses learned, under Minotaur stewardship, the difference between piety and preparedness. The fight themselves were, as always, diagrams that bled. Against Xenos dynasties that had risen from stone beds to reclaim living houses, the chapter leaned on lessons that Orpheus had burned into them. Command nodes broken first, then the rhythm of reassembly disrupted with melter and demolition charges placed like commas in a sentence you intend to shatter. Against greenskin empires that think in weight and momentum, they impose sequence where the enemy prefers flood. Kill the boss, kill the banners, then the guns, each in a box drawn with wire and fire. Against warbands that wore the colours of once brothers, the Minotaurs resume the role the High Lords never admit they keep on a leash. Executioners who know where to cut because their hands were taught the same things long ago. Through all of it, Moloc did not change the habits that make him legible to those who served under him, and intolerable to those who prefer a war leader who can be invited to dinner. He still sat his brazen chair in the Daedelos Krata, with data spilling through the air like rain seen at an angle. He still marked maps with the back of a knuckle, and rewrote operational art as supply mathematics. He still went when the line needs breaking and stood there until they were broken, the bronze wall advancing with that impossible gate, heavy, quick, inevitable. The Minotaur's reputation continued to harden into a tool other commanders reach for with relief and with reluctance. Relief, because tasks that choke other formations go down in the Minotaur's throat without coughing. Reluctance, because the aftertaste is metal and ash. Governors welcome liberation only to discover that order has a flavour they cannot sweeten afterward. Brother chapters, when forced by necessity into joint operations, plan carefully and say little, because the Minotaur's version of success leaves little room for retellings that make anyone look like a knight. Myths inevitably kept pace. The story that Moloc had died on a tomb ship and been found like a coin in a cut seam of rock was told in messes where men laugh too loudly when the light is bad. The story that Asterion Moloc is a title rather than a man persisted in the mouths of those who need the comfort of thinking that a monstrosity can be institutional instead of personal. The story that he owes words to Terra that most of us will never be permitted to hear turned from rumour into ritual. A warning sung under the breath by clerks who saw the Minotaur's sigil on orders and felt their courage loosen. Stories cannot be killed. Moloc has never tried. He kills problems. If there is a ledger, and there is always a ledger, it reads like this. The Minotaurs remain at strength, bloodied, scarred, but strong in hulls and in bodies. Their gene stock is clean again, and guarded with paranoia that would embarrass lesser men into apology. Their Primaris sons now move in ranks that no longer look like insertions but like an inheritance done correctly. Their command remains what it was, direct, unsentimental, savagely competent. And Asterion Moloc. He is where he's always been when the fireworks burn down and the bills arrive. He is visible when he chooses to be, and felt when he does not. He listens to the wall the way a surgeon listens to a chest, for rhythms that meant life, for murmurs that foretell failure, for silences that require intervention. He does not promise hope, he promises ends. In an Imperium that survives by making unendurable routine, such promises are worth more than hymns. The ledger closes, the spear is racked, the storm shield cools. If this transmission served your vigil, strike the seal of subscription and mark the Auspex for alerts, so you do not miss the next dispatch from the dark. This has been Dominissimo Voxlore, reporting from the labyrinth holds of the Daedelos Krata. Stand ready, for the Emperor protects, and return for the next transmission.